In this video, we're going to be talking about minimum wage and why it isn't actually a benefit for people, but actually a negative part for people. It actually goes back to being very, very racist, and what it actually points out, it was actually done by early on was actually the progressive politicians, and this was actually done specifically because the you had racist policies were actually done to essentially protect the white union workers from black non-union workers from essentially taking their jobs, because these black non-union workers were essentially not as skilled, but a company could essentially hire two of them to work the same job, and eventually would be able to get enough production to have the job being done. By hiring two of them, they could essentially hire them at about each at about 40% of the rate which they were willing to work for, and they would be able to work at that amount, and be able to make the ability to pay their own way to work is what they would want for. And the idea was that they were able to earn a living as they saw it. But what minimum wage did was force their wages higher so that they were unhireable, and that the most cost-effective way was to hire one white union worker. And this was done deliberately as a racist policy. And this was both pointed out by both Milton Friedman in 1966 and even later on by Dr. Walter Williams. And it was deliberately done. And if we look at the era with it, we're talking from people like Theodore Roosevelt on through people like FDR. Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and FDR were the key three people. They were part of this movement. And the reason why is because the fact is, you'll find that these were highly racist individuals, and they wanted to essentially protect the white unions, and they were anti-black, as you'll see with their actual voting numbers. You'll see their actual numbers of blacks voting for them were exceptionally low because of this. And while they tried to move to what it called less racist policies to make it even, it became a fact of fact of the matter that it was basically a lot of them still end up making basically labor specific ones to essentially block them out, and essentially price a lot of these blacks out of the market, and that was deliberately done. And if you look at a lot of these things along the history of our country, this is what ended up happening, and that's where minimum wage comes in. Minimum wage is not something that prevents people from working at a higher rate. It actually prevents, and the only thing it prevents is the minimum entry fee of working. That's the only thing minimum wage really is. That's what people need to understand. That's the only thing it you can negotiate at any entry level price of what you're willing to work for. But what the actual issue is what is the minimum plausible rate that you can actually legally work for. And this is the whole point. And this is where we get to certain areas where when people go, oh, if we raise minimum wage, it'll help people. Well, actually it doesn't, because all you're doing is you're creating barriers to work. and that's all minimum wage was meant for since the start. That's what people need to realize. It doesn't help people; it only hurts people. It's actually that's been its original intent from the start, and that's what people need to realize. Is when we look at this, is minimum wage rates are solely done to actually hurt certain groups of people and protect others. It's actually a protectionist policy from the get-go. And when we realize that, we're going to realize that basically as minimum wage is not an actual aid for poor people, but an actual protectionist policy for those who are actually in jobs that would actually require this. So it's essentially meant to block people out from working, to stop them from working. And that's what minimum wage is. Because essentially it's a minimum cost of labor. When you raise that minimum cost of labor, it prevents those people who from getting into labor itself. It doesn't help people out. It actually basically causes an actual raise of the actual cost of labor and of the minimal cost. So when you raise the minimal cost, it doesn't raise the actual spectrum of the cost through the whole area of all types of labor. It just basically says you need to pay this minimum amount for someone to work. The only way that would happen is if there were certain jobs that were paying less than that, then those jobs must come up to that minimum wage or more. Now, if we're a professional job or a job that required certain skills, those jobs would need to be paid above that rate. And that's, in those cases, those jobs would have to be paid well above those rates. They require certain developed skills over a certain time, or certain educated skills over a certain time. And that's a different case. But when it comes to this, is setting an actual minimum wage itself is the only thing that's going to do is price people out the end of the entry. Because the fact is there's a certain when it comes down to business, there's a certain benefit each worker adds to the company, and that's how they determine if the worker is worthwhile. Now, when you first enter into the labor force, what's going to happen is they're not going to view you as a high commodity in the workforce, so they're going to view you as a high risk. So any type of raises in minimum wage are going to cause them to be very, very skeptical in hiring new workers. This leads to the ideas of automation, and it makes it very, very difficult for people with little to no skills to entering the workforce. And it makes it very difficult for someone that's a teenager to enter the workforce, or even someone who's basically just out of high school to enter the workforce, because they don't have any skills. And when we see this is where not only is it do we see these initially racist policies, but we're essentially basically embracing these racist policies as if they were good. And that's, to me, the epitome of insanity. When you're basically claiming a racist policy is good, I mean, we don't do that with any other policies out there. We don't say that slavery is good. We don't go out there clamoring that, oh, slavery is the best thing out there. We don't say that. We don't go out there claiming that that basically executing innocent people out there in the streets is good, and or basically in the internment of the Japanese Americans. We don't claim that was a good policy, which is also done under the progressives. We don't claim any of these things were good, and we don't claim that the slavery is good, which is actually what what had been going on for essentially before mankind had even developed language, but it ended up ending later on through actually Western civilization. But this is so you don't want to essentially embrace bad policy that was done under complete and utter hatred and protectionism, and that's what essentially minimum wage is. If you want to essentially get your best policy, you need to eliminate this. This is what you do. When you see something bad, you eliminate it. You didn't keep slavery on the books with it saying, "Oh, but we think this could be good, used for something positive." No, slavery can never be used for something positive, and that's the same thing with minimum wage. It cannot be used for something positive. It's either A, used to keep people out of the marketplace, or B, it was used for racism. Those are the only two purposes that minimum wage serves. It does not serve any good. So the only solution would be actually to eliminate minimum wage completely and let people actually have full freedom from both sides of the actual business and the actual employee or potential employee to actually negotiate what they're willing to work for. And the argument saying, "Oh, but they need a living wage." Well, they're fully capable of deciding what that wage is. And if that business is not willing to hire them for that amount, then they can go into another business that is and they can work out what they can do for between the actual wage per hour and the actual amount of hours they're willing to work to achieve this. And while they might not get it at the start, they're probably going to have to work a while to earn that, even if it means maybe taking a room, living at a place with a roommate or something, because earlier on in their career they're probably not going to have that high wage because things have a certain cost because of the implications of such things as what we've done during the progressive era, such as adding income tax based on actual labor wages, which was never intended, and adding because people wanted more free things, and also adding on such things as the central banking, which end up diluting the actual value of the currency down to being about 4% of what it was when we actually started the central banking. And that's why when people say we want higher minimum wage, well, there's a reason why the minimum wage is never going to solve it. It only makes the situation worse. Is the minimum wage has gone up several times, and yet it only digs a bigger hole because it's just more inflation. And that's another issue when we come down to it, is it just inflates the actual value. It doesn't actually help out with the actual thing, because it starts basically, instead of the idea of trickling money down as it normally should, it basically creates this trickle up effect of inflation where everything starts to rise rapidly from the bottom up. And you might get a little bit of extra money in your paycheck now, but what's going to happen is the actual cost goes up rapidly, and that's where an actual problem comes. And this is where people need to understand the least bit of economics of why this happens, and not just learn from the Keynesian school, which basically throws out every bit of basic common sense when it comes to actually inflation. There's no such thing as a positive inflation amount. All inflation is bad. Basically, all you're doing is you're trying to inflate the currency to a higher amount, and that's not good. It's basically it's really all you're doing with that is you're taking something which is of a normal size, and you're blowing up and creating a bubble with the currency, and that's all you're doing. And really, it's not worth anymore. It's just basically you're creating more of it. And so when you create this situation, you're just basically creating essentially a domino effect at each higher level of what things cost. So as things start to in this trickle up effect, it causes higher up things to cost more. So when they're looking for housing is going to cost a great deal more than it should, and than it did percentage wise back when the central banking started. If you look at food is going to be a great deal more than it cost back then. If you look at things like cars were a great deal more than they were back then in comparison to the actual costs. I mean, if you look at the actual amount made with it, I mean, even some of the highest priced vehicles, even just going back to the 1960s, some of the highest priced exotic vehicles like Lamborghinis were roughly about four to five times the actual price of the actual wages. Now we got of the average of like an average worker. Now we have basically wages that are basically pretty much equal to potentially going at least a minimum of like 10, if not 100 times that amount. And that's what it called. That's showing some clear inflation just on automotive vehicles, and that's going on the high end with it. This is showing that the high end vehicles should not be jumping up that much in price compared to wages, because there's less of a buyer market. When it comes down to the smaller vehicles, it's even greater of a distance in price as what they used to be. And this is where we're seeing why this inflation from the minimum wage is causing such a problem. And it's nothing but inflation. And it started out with a racist law that was actually disguised as meaning to actually help people. All it did is help white union workers. And it was meant to and this was the basic people it was meant to help. It was meant to basically block black people from getting any types of jobs. And that was the sole reason of the point of it. And when we see that, it was this is one of the reasons why we see when we talk about why blacks are so impoverished today from categorically categorically racist policies. This is the categorically racist policies we're talking about. It's minimum wage. And when they ask for more minimum wage, they're digging themselves a bigger hole. It's like, don't be digging yourselves a bigger hole. You should not be asking for more minimum wage. You should be going out there banging on the doors, telling them to end all minimum wage laws. You should be basically, those people are your enemies. And that's where your actual problems are coming from. It's those people are the ones that have actually done it. It's those policies. It's a lot of these things that have actually broken up families, such as basically a lot of these things, such as public aid, have actually given bad encouragement to bad personal decisions. This government intervention has caused that. You've seen the stuff with Roe v. Wade has also encouraged that as well, with these abortion clinics deliberately put into black and Hispanic areas as well. That's another one. We're seeing that as well. Instead of actually the normal development of families, what we saw previous to that, we're seeing the actual destruction of families. And if you look at the actual comparison, this is why we see, especially with white and Asian Americans, we're seeing a lot more productivity, because they weren't impacted by minimum wage laws, because they were more likely to be linked up with unions, and they weren't impacted with these targeted abortion clinics, and basically they weren't targeted with these with this Greater Society public aid programs. When it comes down to it, is when you get targeted with those things, it ends up destroying a community, and that's what ends up happening. When it comes down to the Asians, yes, they were not union. They kind of had to earn everything from the ground up. And they've been blasted with a lot of racism toward them, but they still did not have the problems being dealt with some of the issues, such as the Great Society garbage. And this is why they've been able to develop successful communities as well. And they've been willing to go into entrepreneurship. And what we see the problems with the black communities is they're not willing to do that. And it's led to the actual destruction of these communities. And when we see this, it's what's created a far worse situation than anything that's happened previous to basically the 20th century. The 20th century has been horrible for blacks because of these laws. Because you've had the Great Society, you've had these Roe v. Wade, you've had minimum wage laws, you've had all these things basically stacked against blacks that were, and yet nobody's talking about this. You've had the war on drugs as well, and all these things stacked against them, and this is what you end up getting. And until they kind of like open up their eyes and realize these people that fight for these things, fight for the war on drugs, fight for the minimum wage, that are fighting for all these things with it, are not your allies. Frankly, they're not. They never have been. They never will be. They're actually your enemies. And still, until you stop voting for these people and actually look the other way and tell them, and basically tell these people you want them out of office because they're actually direct enemies of you, that you're never going to get any better. This is why you look at cities like Chicago, you look at cities like Milwaukee, you look at cities like New York, you look at cities like Los Angeles, cities like San Francisco, cities like Oakland, all these cities like Washington, D.C., they're horrible hellholes. And cities like Newark, New Jersey, basically all these places are complete and utter hellholes. And there's a reason why. because they're designed that way. Baltimore, Maryland, there's another one. They've all been run the exact same way, and they've been designed to be run that way. They've all been run by the same party for the same amount of time. And the reason why is because they're designed that way and they're not going to change. And it doesn't matter you say, hey, that someone's the same as my color. Well, guess what? That person is being bought off. And the fact is they're supporting these racist policies because they're getting a lot of money in their pocket. Look who's basically paying for their campaign. Look who's basically paying them off. They're getting a lot of money for these things. Doesn't matter if it's local or if it's federal. They're getting paid off to do these things. And that's the way things go. This is why they usually get busted for these corruption cases, because they're getting a bunch of money from these groups basically to not end their programs and to basically look the other way when there's severe violations, because they want all these things to continue. And because the fact is just it's just a nice little cushy thing that they have going for them. And they just keep telling everyone keep the whole system going. And that's why when we have these racist policies that have actually been since the turn of the century, we need to realize it's directly from these groups. And it's not, and despite what they want to blame, if they can blame Republicans all they want. Republicans have never supported these ideas. If you look at actually history, look at the actual archives, look at the actual voting totals. Republicans aren't supporting these. Look at the actual history of these cities that have actually had these racial breakdowns. They're never run by Republicans. They've always been run by Democrats. Look at cities like Detroit. Detroit's gone downhill. If you look at with like George Romney basically handed over the city to Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky is a radical left-wing ideologue. That's pretty much what he did. And Saul Alinsky basically got his start by essentially robbing different restaurants around the city of Chicago. He felt it was what it called just because, well, he was hungry, so he basically felt it was just because he could afford it. He basically felt it was just because, well, he felt the restaurant could afford it as well. So that was where he came from. And that's where you find these policies. And if you see with these racist policies, you need to see that they need to end. And they're only going to end if people actually stop burying their head in the sand and actually look where they're coming from. And probably the biggest one is minimum wage. Minimum wage is not some protection for people from people earning less. People are going to act, if you actually go out there and say, I'm not going to work for any less than this, they're not going to hire you for any less than this. It's not going to be forced labor. That's not what this country's developed on. We had plenty of time in this country where people worked at certain wages before. This was actually only a setup for basically blocking blacks from working. That's its only purpose. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share this all the way around on social media, and get as many people as you can to subscribe to my channel. And I will see you guys later.